Okay, Mr. Ewald, you want to start?
So I'm going to call Michele Adams.
You swear affirm the testimony you have clear. You can choose to ask me.
Ms. Adams, I'm showing you a document that's marked Protestant 5. Can you please describe to me what that document is?
This is my resume or CV for my professional experience.
And what do you do for a profession?
I'm a civil engineer. I have a civil engineering firm based in Phoenixville. 15 engineers. I specialize in water resources, stormwater management, as does my firm, as well as civil engineering.
And for how long have you been doing that?
About 38 years.
Do you have education in that, in civil engineering?
I have a BS in civil engineering from Penn State, and I took graduate courses at Drexel and Villanova, and I currently teach graduate water resources classes at the University of Pennsylvania.
And do you hold any licensures or registrations with professional bodies?
I'm a licensed engineer in Pennsylvania in a number of states, and I'm a lead accredited professional related to U.S. Clean Building Council
Okay.
buildings.
And have you ever testified in front of a municipal body before?
Yes,
And have they recognized you as an expert in civil engineering?
yes,
And have you had the opportunity to review the East Vincent Township ordinance and the requirements?
yes,
And have you had an opportunity to review the application and the documents provided by the applicant in this case?
yes, what's available?
And so at this time, I'd ask or offer Michele Adams as an expert in civil engineering.
Ms. London, any objection?
I have no objection to qualifications as an expert.
Mr. Crotty? None. Okay, she'll so be admitted. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I've handed out a packet of slides that's marked as Protestant 6, and they're also displayed on the projector. Did you prepare this report?
I did from the plan set that's currently on the township webpage, dated 5/10/23.
Okay.
Vision set.
And Ms. Adams has asked if the board's okay with her standing up and pointing at the screen if at times during her presentation.
Certainly fine with me, as long as we can make reference to what we're looking at. You have numbered the slides, so I do appreciate that. So at least when you begin to reference something, if you can reference the number of the slide, that would be good for the record.
With reference to slide number 1, can you just explain what you did or what you're trying to show here with slide number 1?
On plan sheet, I think it's 18 of 62. The applicant has the tables with the soils. They should really be on the resource sheet as well. It's hard to read up at the top there, so I enlarged at the bottom, and these are the soils on the type delineated by the orange marks. And at the top of the site, we have the pen soils, which infiltration potential is well drained. If you go over to the column that says retention, infiltration, base, and location, it's somewhat limited. So that top part of the site is probably the best place for infiltration as the applicant is proposing.
And just stick with that for 1
Yeah.
second.
So
What's the impact if the soils are somewhat limited, and what's the impact if those soils are severely limited?
the Croton soils, which are at the lower part of the site, are actually hydric soils, and that's what that red arrow is indicating. That should have been indicated on the resource plan. And it's this hydric soils occasionally ponded. That means high water table, occasionally standing water. It's not going to be a place where you can dig a hole and infiltrate water because it's already wet. And it's not suitable, and it wouldn't meet any requirements in Pennsylvania manual or anywhere else. You can't infiltrate where you've already got a high water table. And so you can see basins 2 and 3 are in the areas that are severely limited, and basin 2 is located in hydric soils. So it's really not suitable for the stormwater system that's been proposed.
Yes.
I also included, this is the language from the Pennsylvania State Code related to riparian buffers under Pennsylvania Chapter 102. A little difficult to read. This is something that Chester County noted that they would need to essentially request what's equivalent to a waiver at the county level, complete module 4, because they're not complying with this. Because they're within 150 feet, the site contains is along or within 150 feet of a perennial or an intermittent stream that is not meeting its water quality requirements. So Pennsylvania has a series of water quality classifications, the highest being exceptional value, the next highest being high quality, and then down from there. And these are required to meet the federal requirements of the Clean Water Act. And under Pennsylvania's designations, exceptional value and high quality are our highest streams, and they're called special protection streams. And there's special requirements they have to meet, including the 150-foot buffer protection and/or restoration. Stony Run is high quality, special protection, and impaired. It's not meeting its designated uses. So it's really important that whatever happened in Stony Run not make conditions worse for Stony Run in terms of water quality. So this is a pretty important riparian buffer restoration should be expected as part of this development. It's just a baseline requirement. If we could go to the next slide.
Just to say for the record, we're up to slide number 5 at this point. Thank you.
So this is the map of the Chester County impaired waters, and you can see at the very top there, that second loop that is East Vincent. And if we go to the next, it's all of Stony Run is impaired. So I zoomed in here. And you can see, yeah, the red on those streams is Stony Run. That means it's not meeting the state water quality impairment requirements. This is the whole purpose of the whole state MS4 program, the municipal separate storm sewer programs, and the permits the DEP's been issuing. It's still early in that permit. There's not been a lot of enforcement yet. But ultimately, the cost of turning those streams red to blue is going to fall to the taxpayers of East Vincent, current and future taxpayers. So that's why we see municipalities like Radnor have a stormwater fee, Tredyffrin's adopting one, Westchester's got one. Municipalities are starting to implement stormwater fees to pay for projects. So it's really important that projects not make conditions worse. The city of Philadelphia actually has a program that has put much of the burden of reducing existing problems on development projects because there's never enough money to pay for all of these. It's very expensive to bring streets back to blue.
So just to make sure I understand that under the MS4 program, the township has an obligation to construct facilities which will take the Stony Run from this impaired status and bring it back to a healthy status.
Yes, and with every permit cycle, additional requirements are imposed, and they will continuously be imposed until the stream meets its designated water quality.
So really, if this project were to impair the stream further, the cost of writing that would fall on the taxpayers.
Restoring Stony Run falls to the residents of East. No, if we could go to the next one. So coming back to the site, this is zooming in on the top part of the site, which brings towards Stony Run. So a couple of things. There's 2 inlets along Stony Run, and I just think it's helpful when we're looking at stormwater plans to have a sense of what's out there, because otherwise you can figure out. So there's 2 inlets. There's a type M, which is a PennDOT type inlet. There's a 14-inch pipe and a 12-inch pipe, and they discharge to the park properties across the street. And again, those orange circles are where the applicant did test borings that used the data to support the stormwater calculations. We could go to the next one, Brian.
Slide 8.
Yeah, this is just the aerial to, if I could get up and point to where those are.
Sure, no problem.
So the one inlet's right up here, the other right by the edge of the driveway, and the other one's right about there. That's the 2 existing discharge points. And if we go to the next slide, there's some Google Street View shots of those inlets. So this is the first inlet looking both directions, looking northwest coming down Stony Run. You can see the red circle. There's a little tiny white poster. That's the post that shows where the inlets are. And then turning around, you can see the inlet. And you can just barely see it's an HDPE type of pipe coming out the other side. So that inlet drains off to the property across the street. And then if we could go to the next
Slide 10.
slide. Oh, this is a close-up of what that inlet looks like now. So one of the stormwater features that the applicant has proposed will discharge into this system, one of the small components. If we can go to the next one, Colin, thank you. If you continue up the road by the driveway where that circle is at the top, that's where the other inlet is, and there's a close-up into it. So that's where the overflow or from basin one, infiltration basin one, or the surface drainage from unmanaged areas in the park property will all come to this inlet on Stony Run Road, and it discharges to the property across the street there. And it's not connecting directly to this inlet according to the plans. The basin will be dug as a hole and built up slightly, and about 10 feet upslope of where that inlet is, there'll be a surface discharge that just discharges the water out there. That's how the water will be discharging out to Stony Run Road. If we could go to the next slide.
Slide 12.
So this is just a close-up of that inlet, that existing inlet. The current plans don't show any proposals to change the thing that it appears to surface discharge.
Now, to be clear, this inlet doesn't have a stormwater detention facility, and it just takes the water from one side of the road to the other and dumps it on the neighbor's property.
Right now it does, and then presumably when the project is, if the project is built, the discharge from basin one will flow overland into this inlet, as well as overland flow from areas of the project and offsite that don't get in the basin. This is where most of the water comes from. We'll go to in the area from basin one. If we could go to the next slide.
Slide 13.
So coming back to the basin, what I've done here is I've highlighted the basin in red so that we could see where it is. That's essentially the emergency overflow elevation that I've highlighted. And this is just showing again, because we don't have the drainage area maps that the conservation district has requested, it's hard to say exactly what the drainage area is draining to this basin and how much, what the drainage areas that are that drain off site. Sorry. But basically, based on the topography, all the area from about here is draining this way. And there's an inlet and pipe here. I've highlighted the pipes in red, and they all go into the basin. This pipe here goes into stormwater bed one.
Ms. Adams, I'm sorry to stop you, but whenever you say this area here or this,
Yeah.
I don't know where that is in a month from now.
Yep.
Can you be a little bit more specific for me?
Thank you.
Sure.
Noting that we're on slide 13.
Yes, thank you.
On slide, a small rectangular area highlighted in red on Stony Run Road is the applicant's proposed stormwater bed one. And it will receive water from an inlet on the proposed road and then discharge to a 14-inch pipe and inlet we looked at earlier that goes across Stony Run Road. This area goes into the basin, into the sediment forebays at either end. This is the basin itself. There are some areas that will be graded and drain around and not go in the basin. But again, without those drainage area maps, it's impossible to tell how big they are, how big that flow is. If we could go to the next map. So the soils tests are really important. First of all, the basin one and bed one, there's map inconsistencies in the documents, and the conservation district pointed that out. I'm assuming they'll be fixed. But those math inconsistencies mean that the numbers right now are not correct until the math is fixed. They're adding in this area about 3.14 acres of impervious surfaces, which will be about 28% impervious. And if you can imagine why it's so important to manage volume, we get about 45, 46 inches of rain in this part of Pennsylvania. And most of it soaks into the ground, only a little bit runs off because you get a lot of small storms. So if you could imagine impervious surfaces add about 3 feet of runoff from every square foot of impervious, it's really important for both flooding and volume management and water quality to manage the volume. But the soil testing issues here, in the documents, in the applicant's documents, there are borings which are done by a drilling rig, and they're case borings, and they fill them up with water to test how well the water moves into the soil. That's sometimes accepted in areas where you can't dig a hole, like in an urban area that's been disturbed and you've got pavement. But normally out here, what's requested and what's expected in the Pennsylvania manual is that you do a deep hole, like they do for septic test, where you can dig basically a 4 or 6 foot deep trench. And that allows a soil scientist to see if there's any limitations. Like, for instance, you might have a high groundwater table and you might be out there in a dry day and not encounter groundwater. But the soils will tell you that the groundwater is sometimes that high. In the borings, it's almost impossible to get that data because it's out of a boring, it's hard to see. If that data is available, it's not in the stormwater report. It's something the township should have to know if these soil tests are valid or not. These pictures I'm pointing to are from the cover of the Stormwater Manual Appendix C, which tells applicants how to do site evaluation and soil testing. So that's the standard approach. One of the things the Conservation District asked for was to put actual elevations on the soil testing. I estimated the elevations. So right now, the existing grade is about 290, where they're going to build the basin. They're basically going to dig out, build up a little bit on the Stony Run side, and the basin bottom will be at 286.5 elevation. It looks like there's rock about 2 feet down. If they have 2 feet of soil, they're just at the minimum for the state and East Vincent ordinances to do an infiltration basin. But it would be really useful to have full information on the soil test. And I noticed that there are borings that were done in the area and in the basin that are not provided. So we really should have all the information to know that this is a system that's going to work. As I noted, when we looked at the soil table, Penn Silt is somewhat limited for retention, infiltration basins, but that site actually, if infiltration is going to work anywhere on this project site, this is their best location up on these soils. Yeah, and we should have all the logs so you can make a full assessment of the actual condition. So I could go to the next slide.
Slide 15.
Another important thing, the stormwater calculations. So engineers use a land use coefficient and a soils type to estimate how much water will run off of the site. So in the field now, and you turn it into houses, they use engineering coefficients, and that tells you how much water. And then the methodology to estimate how fast that water is moving uses what's called a time of concentration, which is basically the estimate of how long it takes water to move from the furthest point to wherever you're analyzing your stormwater discharge. Now, you would assume that on a site that's currently in agriculture in the field, it would take longer for water to run into where the basin will be right now than it will after development. But it's the opposite in the calculations. They're saying 19.1 minutes before, and then after the homes are built and the road and the curbs and the inlets, that water will take 25.7 minutes to get into that basin. This is the single factor that affects peak rates more than anything else. And if this is incorrect, then the peak rates are incorrect. And honestly, the sub areas should be divided into the sub areas and analyzed individually, combined. So the engineering methodology for the stormwater analysis is not done correctly. It's not easy to see this, so I wouldn't fault anyone for not picking it up because I had to dig through the pages of computer output. And I should also mention that Chester County Conservation District and Pennsylvania DEP do not do detailed analysis of stormwater calculations. They rely on the signature of the professional engineer that everything has been done correctly. They do not check the map. So if these are wrong, then the peak estimates will increase, they'll be higher. And so any calculations provided for peak rate control are not going to be reliable. That all needs to be corrected. And all the data should be provided. Some of the computer, not all the computer data, it's in exhibit 100 with the stormwater management report. All the computer sheets should be provided. If you could go to the next one.
Slide 16.
So this is sheet 30 of 62, which is engineering details, and I'm sure it's impossible to read. The stormwater details are right here. So if we go to the next slide, I can mark.
Slide 17.
So this is the detail for the embankment for the stormwater basins with the structure for the outlet and the concrete structures that control flow out of the basins and a pipe through and a discharge point. And this table shows for basins 1, 2, and 3, the different elevations and other details. This diagram over here is supposed to show how the soils in those basins will be amended or treated so that they're suitable for infiltrations. Construction's messy, and what happens in construction is the soils get all turned up, and then when they get wet, the finer particles, the silts and the clays form lenses so that the water can't get through. So it's really important that infiltration basins be built correctly. Many sites now use engineered materials, just like you'd have an engineered specification for something like asphalt paving. We need engineered specifications for stormwater features to work properly. Some states have adopted mandatory specifications. Pennsylvania does not have that yet. But what we have here is 1 foot, 2 feet of amended soils. Now, there's nothing on the plans that shows the contractor like where this feature goes, how big it is, what the dimensions are, is it the entire bottom? Like, there's no clarification. There's no dimensions on this drawing or provided in the table, so it's pretty hard for a contractor to build it. And then the soils themselves, it says 2-part organic topsoil, 1 part peat humus, 1 part sand. If you add that topsoil and humus and stir it up with some sand with the existing topsoil, you're going to get a mucky mess. And that's why so many infiltration basins fail. This one might work because it's on the better soils and higher up on the hill. And then the rain garden is a seed mix from Ernst Seed. And Ernst is highly reputable. They're mostly wetland species. There's no indication of what goes on the side banks, how the side banks of the basins will be planted. And then for these bioretention systems, for those plants to live and work, they really need a maintenance plan and a 3-year maintenance program. Because without maintenance, it will become a weedy mess. So they need to be monitored and maintained for 3 years to really work for infiltration. We could go to the next slide, Colin.
Slide 18.
In the basin, this is that outfall structure. So this is the structure that controls the water that will come from basin 1 to Stony Run Road. And we're looking at a side view, and then if you turn 90 degrees and imagine you're looking through it, this pipe here is this pipe right there. So what this is showing is at the bottom of the basin is at 286.5. And if you go up to 288, basically 1.5 feet, that's where the water will be able to go out when it overflows. And then it will go out into this pipe, a 12-inch pipe, and flow towards Stony Run Road. If the basin fills up more, it'll go out the top in the inlet. The challenge with this is that if the basin does not infiltrate as planned, then all this water here, if that's still in the basin, then the basin won't be able to manage stormwater for the next storm that comes along. And it's more of a worry for basins 2 and 3 than it is for basin 1 because we're on the better soils. But there's no alternate way for water. It's all assumed to infiltrate. And if we end up with a basin that does not infiltrate, then there's no backup plan. And the stormwater will not be managed with peak flow rates towards Stony Run Road. So that combined with the errors in the calculations, the lack of soil testing information, the lack of the detail, all raises in question if this basin will work. I would also note the NTS circled in red, that means not to scale. So these 3 details I'll show you are not to scale, which gets a little confusing. So this one's not too bad. It's 1.5 feet right there, and this is a 12-inch pipe. But some of the others are way out of proportion. So it's hard to look at them and get a feel of what's really being built. Presumably a contractor will read the numbers and get it right, but it's hard if you're not looking at those details to understand what these diagrams are showing. I noted the 2-year pre and the 2-year post. Per the applicant's stormwater report as provided in Exhibit 100, I'm presuming that's changing. We are just there meeting the peak rates. There's really no wiggle room in the 2-year. For the 100-year, the applicant's plan to significantly reduce the peak rate. Okay, yeah, we go to the next slide.
Slide 19.
I just added these couple slides so that so everybody has an understanding. So this is just a diagram showing that There's the ground, and this is applicable not just to this site, but throughout Pennsylvania, and the blue indicates the water. And where the blue groundwater interfaces with topography, that's where we have streams, especially small streams. And when it hasn't been raining for a couple of days, water in the creek is coming out of the groundwater, and the water flows down the slopes to the wetlands and to the stream areas. So that's how the system works in a simple diagram way. If we go to the next one,
Slide
maybe the
20.
next one. Yeah. So what happens when we don't manage stormwater properly for rate and volume, if we overestimate how much is coming out before development, the streams aren't big enough, so they start to erode and get steeper with the steep slides, and we see that in all kinds of streams, and that's a major cause of stream impairment in Pennsylvania and throughout the country. But this is the condition that we want to make sure does not happen. And that affects our wetlands, it affects water supply for wells. It's really important not just to manage stormwater for the flooding conditions, but also that groundwater recharge, because that's our resource. An acre of land will put about 1,000 gallons a day into the groundwater under natural conditions on average. It's not raining every day, but that's how it averages out. You go to the next one. Thank you.
Slide 22.
These are just slides, just what happens when it's not managed. I think we all know. This is Valley Forge National Park where.
Sorry, can I stop for 1 second real quick, Mr. Ewald? Is there a difference between slide 20 and slide 21?
Yeah, they get a little deeper. Is that the channel?
That's the, yes.
Yeah. It just gets a little deeper and straighter on the sides.
I think the width of the channel in the very middle of
For the stream.
diagram.
Here.
Okay, thank you.
That's how it's. So coming back to the lower part of the site, or the downslope part of the site down here, this is just the aerial again. Stony Creek is down, Stony Run is down
Slide
there.
23.
Slide 23. Stony Run is at the bottom of the slide. We could go to the next one.
Slide 24.
You can start to see some of the indications of wetter areas on the aerial. But if we could go to the next slide, we can look at the map of those. So this is back to that same diagram. And again, these are the soils. So this is the Reddington silt loam, which is severely limited.
Sorry, when you say this
I'm
is,
sorry. Little orange coloring on top of the applicant soil line shows where the Reddington silt loam is, which according to the soil table is severely limited for infiltration basins. And then this lowest group here at the bottom of the slide, where it says Croton silt loam, occasionally ponded, is the delineation of the Croton soils. And they're delineated by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and NRCS originally.
And that's the loop between the orange line at the bottom and the green wetland boundary.
Yes, yes. So these are the hybrid soil. And then again, the green is the wetland, this is Stony Run. And these are the test pits the applicant used for designing the basins. If we could go to the next slide.
26.
So again, I took the construction plan and I highlighted it. So the red shows the proposed storm sewer system coming through the houses. Most of this area goes to basin 2. I'm sorry, most of the area on the left side of the exhibit goes to basin 2, and this area on the right side of the exhibit goes to basin 3. The applicant has provided stormwater calculations that look at both basins combined. So the applicant is looking at these basins as they come, as the outfall comes together from both of them to show compliance. If we could go to the next slide, we can look at basin 2. So this
Slide
is basin
27.
2 in more detail. Again, there's about 28.95 acres according to the stormwater report, and about 0.2 acres impervious now. And afterwards, there'll be about 6.15 acres of impervious going to basin 2, about 30% impervious. Again, the map is a little, needs some cleaning up. Again, the same problem as basin 1. The time of concentration, how fast the water is flowing, is assumed to be 23.9. It's assumed to be getting to the basin faster than it will after they build all the inlets and curves and put the impervious area in. The calculations to come up with those numbers provided in the stormwater report are not done correctly, need to be corrected. The time of concentration should be much shorter, which will have the result of providing a much higher peak flow rate. So the flow rates are underestimated into basin 2. Then they use 3 test pits in basin 2, and they discharge to a plunge pool structure. The test pit right here, number 5, encountered water when they were digging the test pit, which is consistent with being near close to hydric soil. If we could go to the next.
Slide 28, and just before you go to 28, if the pit has water in it, what does that say about whether the basin can infiltrate?
You can infiltrate, and that wouldn't pass. It should not pass for acceptance as infiltration testing for stormwater. So basin 2 is in foreign hydric soils. They're proposing about a 9-foot excavation, so digging about a 9-foot deep hole. The proposed bottom is proposed at elevation 271. The elevation of the nearby wetlands is 270. So you're digging a hole down to about the same elevation as the wetlands. And remember, those wetlands are being fed by water moving through that soil, as that earlier diagram showed. So that's how what happens. You know, the water is moving through. So if you dig a hole, you're likely to encounter that soil, that water. This is where doing full soil test pits and having logs of those soil conditions would let a soil scientist determine if there is high water in this area and if this basin is likely to fill up with water once it's built. So those soil tests are really important. Other things to note, we're right up against the edge of the FEMA 100 floodplain boundaries. We're down in a really wet area, discharging in. This is not a hard and fast line by FEMA. Those the 100-year estimates can be off by several feet. They're estimates. As I mentioned, the township should request more soils data. And then if we could go to the next slide.
29.
This is showing the outlet structure for basin 2 from the applicant's drawing. Similar situation, we're looking at the side view and then looking at a front view. So this outlet structure is a big concrete structure. There will be 3 24-inch pipes coming out of this and 3 very large pipes. The bottom of the basin is a 271, and then there's a weir, like a small dam, at elevation 272.4. So this is where the drawings of details not to scale gets very misleading, because this is 1.4 feet to where the water overflows, and those are 2-foot pipes. So those pipes are higher. This is not drawn, and they will really it should be for something like this. Again, if this fills with water or does not infiltrate, then that capacity in that basin won't be there to provide the stormwater management. Calculations are not done correctly to begin with, and then if the basin doesn't manage the stormwater, what you'll have is lack of stormwater management and all the impacts to Stony Run Road. Again, I put the numbers down here. For this one, the applicant is saying for both basins 2 and 3, the pre-development's around 100 CFS and the post-development will be 100 CFS.
So what does CFS stand for?
I'm sorry, cubic feet per second.
During the 100-year storm, water would be coming out of this basin at 100.59 cubic feet per second.
And the applicant's estimating that's what happens now. That if you can imagine a wall of water a foot high and 100 feet long, every cubic foot, every second coming at you, that's how much water the applicant's estimating is happening now. That's not correct, I don't believe. That's not what happens out there. But what happens if you overestimate the pre-development, you don't have to manage as much stormwater in your stormwater control. So that's reflected in the time of concentration calculations, etc. So yes, it's a lot of water. And again, these values will change after the corrections requested by the conservation district. And if we had that detailed drainage area map, we'd be able to see what water is going around the basin, what water is going in the basin. Right now, it's not indicated on the plans. So if you go to the next one, Colin, thank you. And then the third basin, basin 3 over here, similar conditions. We're not in the Croton silt loam. We're just in the Reddington. And the next slide has a enlargement of that basin.
Slide 31.
Slide 31. Again, the map concerns, we're putting about 5.4 acres of impervious in a 14, almost 15 acre drainage area. So this one's about 36% impervious. The Center for Watershed Protection says about 10% impervious will start to have significant watershed changes. So that's the threshold that's used by the industry where you see the impacts. No soil test, no high water was indicated in the borings, but again, it would be very useful to have the full soil test pit results. The time of concentration here is not flipped. They're assuming 20 minutes after. That still seems like a pretty long time of concentration and flowing in pipes, not overlaying. That should be corrected, but it's not less than the pre-development of 33.7 for the one area. Again, because the maps aren't there, it's hard to tell which areas these kind of concentrations refer to. So that's all information is needed by an engineer to really figure out are the calculations valid and use the map. So if we could go to the next, oh, and yeah, if we could go to the next one, Paul, thank you.
Slide 32.
It's also located in poor soils. Here they're going to only excavate about 4 feet of excavation. But again, a similar situation, the bottom of this basin will be down to 272 and the wetlands are at about 270, the wetlands over here. So we're digging a hole the same elevation as the wetlands.
And are the soils modified below that 272?
Yes, that's what the applicant's diagram shows, where it says you modify the 2 feet of soils. You would then, if the bottom's at 272, you would dig another 2 feet down to 270, mix that soil up, put it back. And that would be your base.
Which is the same height or as the wetlands.
A little bit higher, but not by much. It's 270 over there. So this is all a wet area. It's not the correct area to be placing your infiltration system. We can go to the next one. Thank you. Again, the basin 3 outlet. So basin 3 has 2 18-inch pipes that will come out. And they have 272, so it's about a foot of water. So again, we have the same thing that the pipes are a foot and a half, and this is supposed to be a foot of water. So things are not to scale, which is confusing. But again, if this basin does not hold that water and infiltrate it, then none of the stormwater calculations are accurate, and stormwater requirements won't be met. They will not manage for rate, they won't manage for water quality, and they won't manage for volume. And there's lots of examples of basins like this that have failed. If any of you are familiar with the basins, you can see from the Route 29 slip ramp. There's basins that were built at the slip ramp with the turnpike. You can see they're full of cattails and phragmites. Those were supposed to be infiltration basins. After the turnpike built them, they did not infiltrate, they encountered groundwater. They had to go back and do some fixes, but there was no way to make those basins do what they were originally supposed to do. So as a result of those basins not being built, not functioning as they were supposed to, when the turnpike built the next part of that's under construction, there was significant negotiation that they have to do a lot more detailed design, provide the soils test, use engineered soils in their basins, maintenance plans, all the things that hopefully will get the new section of turnpike stormwater systems to work, because what happens is the township is left with stormwater facilities that don't work. And that is what a lot of the municipalities that have implemented MS4 fees like Radnor are fixing. That's what they're spending their money on, fixing problems.
So in the event that this stormwater system doesn't work, who ends up paying for it?
The homeowner association theoretically, but it usually ends up being in township. I've never seen a homeowner association be held to construction cost. It comes out of the township coffers usually. Every case I've ever encountered. We could go to the next one, Tom. I think that's about it. So that's just
34.
The overview of what's being proposed. And to go to the next one, I think there's, yeah, this is
35.
just a diagram showing how the water infiltrates, and in a natural system, it averages out to about 1,000 gallons a day. And that water is really important. That base flow, that infiltration keeps the stream running. And there have been cases before the Environmental Hearing Board in Pennsylvania that have confirmed that losing base flow, losing infiltration is a diminishing of water quality. You lose that into the bone. So it's really important that the infiltration work. If we go to the next one, this is just showing that most of the storms we get are small storms. So if we go to the next slide, I think it shows in 2009, EPA came out with a stormwater policy saying we need to manage volume for natural hydrologic conditions or capture the 95th percentile storm, which is about 1.8 inches in this part of Pennsylvania. There was hopes that this would become a national stormwater policy. It didn't. It has been adopted in some states. Maryland has moved in this direction. It's been about 10 years in Maryland. Others are. The reason for this is because there's so much noise in the engineering calculations, and it's so easy to manipulate them about flow rates. But if we start to hold the water in the volume, then we're hitting the goals that EPA is trying to achieve. This is applied to federal facilities, but it's not become a national stormwater rule.
And that was slide 37.
Yeah, and I think that's all I've got. Oh, this is just a slide showing that we talked about impervious coverage. This is a slide from some data down in Atlanta showing that when watershed impervious area increases, sensitive species really drop off. So it's the stormwater that is impacting the health of the streams and causing the impairment. When you have the impervious surfaces, the increased volume, the pollutants, and the temperature really knock the species back. And this is what's important to get those red streams to move. I think that's the last one. Thank you.
And what's the impact on the groundwater when stormwater systems fail like this?
If you're not having the recharge, then you're not putting the base flow back. So that impacts the base flow to the streams, which keeps the streams flowing. It also impacts things like water supply wells and groundwater levels.
Okay. And so I've heard you talk about the challenges with this project and how the structure of these proposed basins. In your opinion, what's the solution to what the problems that you've just pointed out?
I think if you're going to develop this site, you need a stormwater system that manages the volume on the better soils where you have room to adequately test, adequately design. There is probably a carrying capacity to the size of the site and how much you can put there. That's why in very urbanized areas, they start to do things like green roofs and alternate practices because you can only infiltrate so much water. But if you were going to design the site with that density, you would need a system capable of handling the amount of runoff you're going to generate from the amount of proposed impervious surfaces and even the turf surfaces that are proposed, because those don't drain as well as natural soils.
So the density impacts how well the stormwater systems work.
The density is certainly a factor to design a stormwater system. You have to design a stormwater system capable of handling the density.
And you mentioned earlier that the applicant's requesting a waiver from the 4-step process. If you were to make a recommendation to the township on whether to grant or deny that waiver, what recommendation would you make?
I would deny it because the 4-step process would allow the applicant to take a closer look at the conditions of the soil at the site and design accordingly.
Those are all the questions I have under it.
Okay, it's right now 8 o'clock, and that seems like a natural point to take our first break for the evening. So let's go off the record for 5 or 8 minutes, and then we'll come back with cross-exam. All right, so let's go back on the record. We'll start with cross-examination. Ms. London, you want to start with you?
Yes, that'd be fine. Good evening, Ms. Adams.
Good evening.
I'd like you to turn in Protestant Exhibit 6 to slide number 3. And we'll just go through Protestant Exhibit 6, and I'll just call it slide by slide. Looking at Protestant Exhibit 6, slide 3, you reference the soil types and what is the best part and the part that you consider less ideal for drainage basins. But isn't it correct that with stormwater measures and best management practices that a builder can compensate for soil types?
Not at all, not unless you're replacing those soils with engineered soils, which this plan is not doing.
But there were techniques used, including replacement of the soil. Could that compensate?
Potentially, if the systems were designed so they could actually infiltrate and there were no limiting factors like rock or high water table.
Now, with respect to slide number 4, which is the Pennsylvania Code, you testified regarding degradation of the stream. Are you aware that this project is going to be utilizing public sewer?
Yes,
Okay, and do you agree that public sewer is going to protect the stream from further degradation?
no, I have no basis to make that decision. There's no basis to decide that.
Do you agree that public sewer, in addition to stormwater best management practices, is necessary to protect the quality of streams?
Not at all.
So septic system would be equally protected?
A properly designed plated septic system where the soils are suitable would be protective, as would alternative septic systems that have things like nitrogen denitrification systems. So a properly designed on-site system designed to the carrying capacity of the site would protect the quality of the stream. That's why measures like that have been encoded in places like Prince Anne County in Maryland to protect the quality of the bay.
But public sewer does not protect quality streams?
Public sewer takes the water away. So it's not a measure to protect or degrade a system. Sometimes when public sewer lines come in, they become conduits for lowering the groundwater table. In other words, the groundwater movement will move along the soils and the stone placed around sanitary sewer pipes. So often you'll see areas where the water table is lowered or impacted because of the placement of sanitary sewers.
But you have no indication that will happen in this case, correct?
I have not evaluated if that will happen in this case.
Looking at slides number 5 and 6, you commented that if there are impaired streams due to improper stormwater management or a stormwater system that does not work properly, that the cost will fall to the taxpayers. Is that your testimony?
The MS4 program is imposing requirements on municipalities to implement practices to restore water quality in streams that are not meeting their designated uses for many causes, but the primary cause for many of these watersheds is stormwater management. It's lack of stormwater.
Isn't it correct that townships routinely assess a stormwater escrow to pay for the cost of stormwater measures?
East Vincent does not have a stormwater fee or a stormwater program to collect from the residents at this time to pay for practices to restore the water quality. That's why other municipalities like Westchester and Radnor have implemented stormwater fee programs. Tredyffrin is currently in that process.
Isn't it correct, though, that stormwater improvements are secured by financial security under a municipal improvements agreement?
Related to a specific development meeting the requirements as shown on the plans, but once the project is built and done, if there continue to be impacts from the system not working, that escrow is released once the system's built according to the plans.
Isn't it correct, though, that there is a maintenance escrow for another 18 months after completion of construction?
There is a maintenance escrow, but once that maintenance escrow is done, if you're 5 years down the road and the basin's not infiltrating, that falls to the township.
Most likely, wouldn't within 18 months, whether the basin's infiltrating or not?
You might, but then you'd have to take action and insist and It puts the burden on the municipality for those repairs, and once the project's built, and you've built the development and you've built the basin, if it's not infiltrating, you're very limited in what you can do to make it work. That's the situation the Turnpike ran into at the slip ramps. And that led to the litigation against the Turnpike, which reached a settlement that the Turnpike would change their entire approach to stormwater management and design. So they didn't recreate the problem of those slip ramp basins because those do not provide the peak rate and volume control that they were intended to.
However, though, for the time of construction and during the maintenance period, isn't that a time of more intensive monitoring that the township would know or have reason to know that the stormwater system wasn't working?
Again, that would put the burden on the township of establishing that it's not working, not releasing the escrow, and then coming back after the applicant for a new design and a new plan to address the stormwater, because there's no easy fix when basins that don't infiltrate because they have water in them. You can't just fix those
Wasn't the
basins.
township supposed to be the guardian of health, safety, and welfare and in the position of monitoring?
I would certainly hope so.
Going on to slides number 9 and 10, where we look at pictures of existing inlets. Isn't it correct that inlets will be improved and enlarged as part of the construction process?
I believe inlets will be improved and enlarged, but they are still the existing inlets. I don't think the pipes under the road are being changed.
However, what you're seeing in these pictures, though, is going to be improved from what you're seeing now, correct?
My understanding is they will replace the boxes. They will still be receiving the water from the site. It has to get into the inlets and be able to handle them. And those inlets will still be conveying the water to discharge onto the properties across the street. And if the basins don't manage the stormwater per the applicant's estimates, then there will be an increased rate of water reaching those properties across the street.
Now, you're mentioning properties across the street and neighboring properties. Isn't it correct that an NPDES requirement permit is going to be required?
It is,
And
yes.
isn't it correct that the NPDES permit does not allow increased flow onto neighboring properties?
That is correct, but it's also true that the Conservation District and the DEP engineers do not check the stormwater calculations. They rely on the professional engineer who's signing and sealing them to essentially Scout's honor that all the calculations are correct and that everything will work as designed. The
No,
DEP does not check the stormwater
Now,
calculations.
you have a difference of opinion, but isn't it correct that reasonable engineering estimates can differ?
No, there are things that my old surveying professor used to call errors when the math is wrong and you don't add things up. And there's things he used to call blunders when you just have the methodology wrong. And I would call the time of concentration a blunder in this application.
However, if it were obviously incorrect, wouldn't you agree that he or the conservation district would red flag it?
Not at all, because in order to find those numbers, I had to go into the stormwater report. And if you can see my yellow highlights on these computer outlook pages, there's no page that makes it easy to find all the information. So I am going through the tables and going through the computer output, not all of which is in the stormwater report, to find that information. And I'm looking at post-development flow, and the engineer is assuming sheet flow for all the flow post-development to BMP1, which doesn't account for water going in inlets and pipes and draining the way it will to that basin.
You're claiming that the information that you have is incomplete, correct?
I'm saying that all the computer output reports are not in this document. I could not find every storm.
You base your reporting, your information on the May 10th, 2023 submission to the Chester County Conservation District and DEP, correct?
I based my evaluation of the plans based on the drawings, which are available on the township's website. And I reviewed the stormwater report that was exhibit 100.
And
If there's an updated stormwater report, it is not publicly available on the township
are you
website.
aware that the applicant received a technical deficiency notice from the Chester County Conservation District?
Yes, I forget what exhibit number that was, but the Chester County Conservation District commented on a number of things, including requesting that the drainage areas be clearly defined, etc.
And are you aware that the applicant has made a new submission or a revised submission based upon that technical deficiency notice?
I am aware that Adam Brower testified that they would be resubmitting very quickly at the last
So
testimony.
you have not seen that, correct?
I have not reviewed the documents of Chester County Conservation District.
I'd like you to go to number 15. And I'm going to ask the same question of you of this as I'm going to ask regarding number 27, because it deals with the same issue. You had stated that you believe there is an error because the rate is faster pre-development than post-development. Is that a correct assertion?
No, the
Or-
time of concentration is smaller before development than
Okay.
after development.
All right, is it correct that with stormwater management controls in place, that water could in fact move at a slower rate post-development than pre-development?
But the calculations are estimating what's going into the basin, not what's coming out of the basin. According to the stormwater report, they're estimating, calculating the flows coming into the basin. So you've not implemented your stormwater controls.
But wouldn't you agree that with stormwater controls in place, that could considerably slow the time of concentration?
No, the time of concentration represents the water moving overland into the stormwater feature. Once it's in the stormwater feature, then you use what's called a stage storage curve, which is like a reservoir, to calculate how the water is in that system, whether it's discharging out the pipe, whether it's infiltrating, etc.
But even if you've made changes to impervious cover, changes to grade, that these wouldn't affect the time of concentration and couldn't slow it down considerably.
I don't understand the question. Can you repeat it?
With changes to such features as grading, impervious cover, and other features to control stormwater, that the time of concentration couldn't be slowed down considerably.
Those features don't exist on this site right now. There's inlets and pipes that take the water into the basin, so there's nothing to slow that water down.
But wouldn't you say that with number 15 as well as with number 23, that the hypotheticals before versus after that development could change that and could slow it down considerably?
If the stormwater design were changed and there were practices implemented to slow the water down, yes, that could slow the time of
So
concentration.
it is hypothetical.
That is
possible.
not what's on this plan. The other component that the conservation district pointed out that I did not speak to is that when you calculate the infiltration rates and how the water's moving in these features, you're supposed to adjust your tested data and not use your highest values. So the conservation district had comments that will lower the estimated infiltration rates that the applicant's using. I did not mention that in my testimony.
I'd like you to go to number 16, slide 16 and 17. You agree that the plans you reviewed are at preliminary plan stage?
My understanding is that they're the preliminary review stage, yes.
But isn't it correct that final plans or construction plans will have the final details for the infiltration basins?
Presumably, but if I were reviewing these plans, one of my most critical comments would be to get those details on there and get them correct.
But you agree though that those will be on their final plan and have to be in order for it to be approved as final plan.
I don't believe there's been anything in the review comments yet that have recommended any changes to these details.
I'd like you to go to slide number 25. This again is a question regarding the soil type. You refer to soil types as the Reddington silt loam and part of the site and the Croton soils on another part of the site. Isn't it correct that even soils that you classify as limited for drainage with stormwater management systems in place can be utilized and can meet requirements for drainage basins.
Not for infiltration systems, no.
Yeah, isn't it correct, though, that the basins can be designed to infiltrate?
Not if the soils are poor and the groundwater table is high, no.
Can anything be added? Couldn't anything be added to those?
To make them infiltrate, no.
Okay, and that is your opinion that there's nothing that can be done to make them infiltrate?
If the groundwater table is high, you're encountering the groundwater table.
Now, on slide number 28. You are claiming that basin number 2, you claim it's up against the edge of the floodplain. Is that correct?
It's in close proximity to the mapped floodplain, and my point was that floodplain, although it's a legal line on a map based on the flood insurance rate maps, when FEMA calculates those elevations, it's an approximation and it can easily be several feet higher. It's never good to assume that's the actual flood elevation.
But you're not alleging that basin number 2 is in the FEMA floodplain?
I am not. It discharges right in close proximity to the floodplain and the riparian buffer and the state 150-foot.
Staying with basin number 2 and slide number 29. You can't say that with certainty that basin number 2 will not infiltrate, correct?
No, I would say in my engineering opinion, based on available information, that since groundwater was encountered in test pit 5 and all the information is not available and it's at the same elevation as the adjacent wetlands, that it is my opinion that will not infiltrate.
Okay, but you can't say that with certainty.
No, but I have a 6.5 acre farm in East Vincent, and every time I dig a hole near the wetlands, they fill up with water.
And with basin number 3, I'll ask the same question. You can't say with certainty that basin number 3 will fail, can you?
It is my professional opinion that basin number 3 will intercept the water moving through the soil down to Stony Run. And since it's such a close elevation to the adjacent wetlands, water will be encountered or will limit the amount of infiltration because you're supposed to have at least 2 feet above the water table for infiltration, according to the Pennsylvania Stormwater Manual. If this basin is going to work, I think a lot more data is needed in terms of the soil logs and the information to support the engineer's assumptions.
So you're stating that more information is needed then?
I'm saying it's my opinion based on the available data and the elevation of the basin and the elevation of the adjacent wetlands that I would anticipate that this would not infiltrate based on my experience of observing many failed basins. I would expect this would not work.
You agree that in order to get the NPDES permit necessary, that the applicant will have to satisfy DEP's and Chester County Conservation District's comments, correct?
Yes, but as I mentioned, they do not check the stormwater or the engineering. They rely on the signatory of the professional engineer that they are confirming that everything will work.
Okay, do you agree, though, that once we satisfy the comments and provide further information, do you accept that those approvals are generally protective of the public?
No, I've been involved in a number of cases that have gone before the Environmental Hearing Board to appeal those NPDES permits, and we've been successful in a number of cases. The department does not always get it right. They don't have the resources to have the level of review that it's taken me to note a number of the problems with this application. I have spent probably 30 hours combing through this material. The department does not have those resources.
But you agree that there is more, that in a lot of this, there is more data needed, and that the applicant has responded to DEP and Conservation District.
The applicant has responded, is my understanding. My professional opinion is this probably needs a redesign to meet the requirements of the state and the township.
But you're saying probably, you're not saying with absolute certainty.
Yeah, with absolute certainty that basin number 2 and basin number 3 are not going to meet the requirements of the township.
I have nothing further.
Okay.
Yeah, just a few. So if Ms. Adams, if we look at the riparian border with Stony Run and its impaired status, it's currently impaired, right?
Yes, it's impaired now.
If this development were to go in, what features of it could be implemented to lessen that impairment?
a stormwater system that manages volume and rate based on the capacity and ability of the site, which means managing the stormwater in locations and on soils that can handle the volume of the stormwater generated from the impervious surfaces. If those soils aren't available, then alternate methods for stormwater management that reduce the volume and meet the requirements of the ordinance.
But does that just get you to break even where it's not further impairing it, or does that have the effect of lessening how impaired it is?
This development is not being asked to lessen the impairment. This development is only being asked by the ordinances not to make it worse.
And with respect to the errors versus blunders kind of dichotomy you had, there's a number of portions in your slides that say math doesn't add up. Is that in the error part, or where it could be fixed and more information could be provided?
Yeah.
Or is that the blunder part?
That's the error part, and that's a comment that the Chester County Conservation District pointed out, that the addition between the forms and the information in the model and the information in the drawing connect. That's the only data. And that was something the district requested to be addressed.
And so looking then on the blunder side of things, I think you said time of concentration estimates.
Yeah.
You would feel would be blunders where they can't be fixed?
The engineering methodology has been applied incorrectly. They can be fixed. You just need to calculate appropriate numbers and then apply them to your stormwater calculation.
So what information would be needed in order to ascertain by you or the township engineer or county conservation district that those TOC estimates are correct?
There's forms that the applicant fills out as part of the computer model, the time of calculation sheets, and those should be completed according to standard practices, engineering practices for calculating time of concentration. I'm not finding one right now. And then applied in the model.
So is your testimony that they did not fill those forms out correctly?
No, they filled the forms out, but they didn't fill them out correctly. So for example, post-development to BMP2, they're saying they're calculating sheet flow and then shallow concentrated flow. But it really should be like channel flow as it gets into the inlets and into the structures that convey that water very quickly. I think what's happening here is that they're estimating one time of concentration for both on-site areas that will be developed and off-site areas that come onto the site or go around the practices. And that gets back to the conservation district's comment that please show the drainage areas and how these areas will be draining before and after development. And then that would require time of concentration worksheets that represent each of those drainage areas. And what DEP requires as part of their normal practice and the Pennsylvania manual is that if you have different drainage areas, like a developed area and an area that's not going to be developed, you develop different flow rates. You look at them separately and then you add your what's called hydrographs together. So it's a more detailed analysis than what appears to have been done here.
And I think as you just mentioned, that was raised by Chester County Conservation District in its review.
Yeah, they didn't raise the time of concentration, they raised the drainage area.
But as I understand what you said, correct me if I'm wrong, the drainage area issue is driven by the time of concentration worksheets.
No, once you have your drainage areas, you calculate your time of concentration. It's the first in the drainage area. The conservation district is also interested in the drainage areas for erosion and sediment control purposes. So they have multiple reasons to want to know. But you need your drainage area and then you calculate your time of concentration and then you apply it to the model.
So to try to summarize best I can in layman's terms, the deficiencies that you're trying to point out, one would be you would like further review of the time of concentration worksheets done as the project progresses.
It's not what I would like or not like. It's standard engineering practice to have your delineated drainage areas and then calculate your time of concentration according to the methodologies in TR 55 or in the USDA engineering handbook.
So who's the one that would determine whether that's been done or not been done?
Presumably the township engineer, but it's, as I mentioned, it's a lot to expect DEP or the township engineer to go through all these computer outputs and pull up this information. It's a lot of time, which is why the township would be well served when issues come up to have specialists evaluate them. It's not fair to ask the township engineer to be an expert in everything.
So have you done the calculations for any of the different basins as to what the proper TOC would be?
No, I have not tried to redo their map. I have not had time for that.
In terms of the pre and post time of concentration numbers, what features could be implemented, if any, that would slow down that pre versus post?
For the time of concentration?
Yep.
So if you implemented practices along the way that were stormwater practices, like in a low impact development or a green infrastructure approach to stormwater, you could potentially lengthen your time of concentration.
And what would those practices be?
Distributed stormwater measures, infiltration beds throughout the houses, practices for swales and systems that infiltrate as if conveying water rather than just putting it in inlet. There are projects that implement those kinds of practices, but that is not what's on this.
There's a reference in a couple of your slides to more information needed from the, I guess, the drilling logs.
Yes, the stormwater report includes a couple pages at the end of the case borehole falling permeability test. But usually stormwater reports will have a whole geotechnical report where they'll have all the information from every boring that was done. And they'll also do, as I mentioned, the deep holes, the same as Hollis Weston would do for a septic system in the township. She would dig a hole so she could see, or have the contractor dig a hole so she could see the soil horizons and see any indications of things like high groundwater tables, because the soil will have modeling if the groundwater is occasionally high, even if there's not water in the hole the day you dig the hole. Those are things that are very difficult to see from borings, and if that data exists, it's not been provided in the stormwater record.
And then just a clarification question, as we look at slides. Nine and 10 and 11. Just so I get myself oriented correctly. These are the Google Earth
Yeah.
street views. Which side is the development on? The right-hand side of these photos?
It flips around the direction it's looking. On the top one, it's looking northwest, and on the bottom one, it's looking southeast. So on the top one, it's on the left, and on the bottom one, it's on the right. That makes sense? Might have been
For slide number 9.
for slide number 9, yeah. So you're looking at this, the same area, but from different perspectives.
So if we look at slide 10, is that on the development side or the other side?
That's the development side.
And what about slide 11? Those look like they're both looking northwest.
They're both looking in the same direction, northwest, and that's the development sites on the left and the inlets on the development parcel.
Okay, that's all the questions I have.
Does the board have any questions for this witness?
No, I don't have any questions.
I don't have any questions.
Okay. I have two, ma'am. I heard you say that two things, that if the stormwater management system fails, the burden falls on the township to make the repairs. That was on cross-examination by Ms. London. You'd agree that would only happen if the homeowners association fails to maintain the basins pursuant to the stormwater operations and maintenance agreement that they're required to enter into with the township, which is also recorded with the township.
Yes, but I can tell you many cases in many townships where those homeowners associations are not equipped to handle the kinds of stormwater problems that come from the failures, and they look to the township to help them solve their problems. That's what happens in actual situations. When the
Right.
developer's escrow is gone and you're 5 years down the road, that's what happens.
Fair enough. And I will tell you, I've seen it the other way where we have actually done that, but and made the HOAs comply. But you'd agree with me that the burden is on the HOA and it only goes to the township if the HOA does not maintain it.
And the burden of attaining the water quality in Stony Run is on the township. So
I
the
hear you.
HOA doesn't deal with it.
I hear you. We have MS4 requirements that the HOA does not have.
Correct.
But The O and M agreement is with the homeowners association. It's not the township's obligation to maintain the basins. You'd agree with that?
I would agree with that, and
Okay.
I wish it was the answer in so many situations.
I also heard you say that, in your opinion, the system needs to be redesigned to meet the requirements of the township.
Yeah.
And I think your slide was consistent with that. What specific requirements of the township do you believe this plan fails to meet?
I can pull up the ordinance and cite them specifically if you like, but specifically volume control, water quality, and flow rate.
Okay, actually, if you have specific sections, that would be immensely helpful to me.
The ordinance. All right, there's multiple sections under the purpose, but if you go to,
Which chapter are you in, ma'am? I'm
I'm
sorry.
sorry, chapter 23, stormwater management.
Thank you.
23-305, water quality and runoff volume requirements. There's requirements specifically in here for managing volume, drawing down within a certain time, achieving infiltration. Those are the requirements.
That's all in 305?
That's in 23-305, water quality and runoff volume. Infiltration requirements are in 23-306. Stormwater peak rate controls, stream channel protection requirements are in 23-307. So you're not causing the stream erosion from too much discharge. And stormwater peak rate control requirements are in 23-308. The discussion on the methodologies is codified in 23-309.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. Ms. London, do you have any other questions?
No, I don't.
Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry, Mr. Ewald. I meant to come back to you.
Now, you were asked about the inlets and what there were on Stony Run and the improvements that are proposed to be made to the inlets. Does anything about the improvements to those inlets reduce the amount of flow that would go into the neighbor's property?
Not at all.
Now, you were also asked about the applicant's response letter to the Conservation District's notice, or I'm sorry, what is the title?
The NPDS permit application and
And the technical deficiencies. Sorry. I just
Yeah.
couldn't get that right.
okay.
So you were asked about the applicant's response letter to the technical deficiencies letter. Did the applicant provide you or the Protestants with a copy of that letter?
No, I don't have a copy of it. It's not available on the township's website.
Okay,
More up, if they've updated the stormwater report, that should also be available, posted on the website.
and it wasn't.
No,
And you had mentioned that the calculations that you examined, it would be a lot to expect of the township engineer to do the digging that you did. And that they'd be well served by having a specialist to make such review. It would be a civil engineer who would make that, and what would their specialty be?
water resources and hydrology.
And if these basins fail, as you predict they would, what would be the impact on downstream flooding?
If the basins don't manage the volume and the rate for the requirements, then you're gonna have too much water discharge. It'll contribute to erosion of the channel and degradation of water quality. It can contribute to downstream flooding. If the basins aren't infiltrating, you'll have all that warm water from the impervious surfaces and the roads going through the basin into the creek, which affects the aquatic life and the water quality. And that's been well researched by Stroud Water Research Center down in southern Chester County. That temperature is a big impact on stream health and water quality. So flooding, channel stability and erosion, downstream conditions, water quality and the stream health, as well as nuisance flooding.
That's all I have on reader.
Any further questions from any council?
No.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Ewald, you don't have anything further for tonight, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so it's just about 12 minutes of 9. As I mentioned before, we're going to continue the hearing tonight unless there's anything further from council until July 19th at 7 p.m. At which point Mr. Crotty will put on his witnesses for the planning commission. I don't know if we'll get through them or not. I did email council today and ask that you please provide availability for your dates in August. I recognize we're getting into vacations for all of us. We'll do the best that we can. So would you kindly provide those dates when you're able, and then we'll see if we can find a date in August for another hearing. Thanks, everyone. Standing continuance for tonight.